Excellencies, President of the Human Rights Council, distinguished representatives of Indigenous peoples, national human rights institutions, United Nations agencies and civil society organisations, all delegates. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples welcomes you all. Ladies and gentlemen, before moving to the formal program of the session, I would like to invite Chief Deskahay to perform a traditional opening ceremony. Thank you.
Adananda, Nikan go there, as what town CEOs, Guy White go, Awado. Nay, do I what can to, Sangoya this so, Sanguawi, gonna honyo. Nay, they always scan out, do not done you. Nay, dinate in the way, hake, ye hear Scott and Dwaya, and go on and go hot. Scott and what at no honyo, they take any octone, and go on and go hot. And on eight and Dwar through, we say, oh, when's the nay again, the Ogwan should I get draw, quite to know, hot the one home quat. O the one good no, what you own, a ton on ya, no, a dehadoni, Gadino, Ganyadano, Gihendano, oh no mound on you, nay, Gion Heko, nay go to set to you wow on you, nay, nay, and do the way I know, the one honyo, nay to get any octone, and go on to go hot. A dane ona and the water through, it's a guy and Sahada a Towayani, Sangoya this so. Guy and that guy when extra, Nanso, oh, when's again? Hega, question it, qua had you one of the guess. It is so, did you know whom qua? And the car, qua, guess who's can't get to go, what? Said what, ja, they said, no whom qua. So hey, car, and neat dog, guess it is so, and neat dear, you know whom qua. Or just on the shot, sent go here dog, it is so, and neat dear, you know whom qua. I didn't endure the way I know, dear, you know whom you, I take any up tongue, and go on to go. And Dane on and war true, it said of go on, as can you die? Away who on, a touch words, nay, does a high white, what? Sent now and song way a hang go hand or how much ready young. I didn't endure the way I know, the said one on you. Said we go on, as can you die? And take any up tongue, and go on to go. And Dane on and war true, it gay young with dog, had you yak on, and nay get nay deal can't you don't scan up, don't know, don't you? Hey, didn't endure the way I know, dear Tino, you gay young good dog, had you yak on it, dear can't you don't. And take any up tongue, and go on to go. And Dane on and war true, how get gone here the hungry, Sangoya this so. Nate so to set on this scan, I don't know, don't you? He didn't endure the way I know, the said on you, gone here the hungry, Sangoya this so. Take any up tongue, and go on to go. Donito. So just a quick translation. I greet you all and glad that you are all here today and we're all well. We give thanks to the natural world. And we start at lowest to the ground, to the earth. We give thanks to the weeds, the medicines that are contained in those grasses, in those weeds. We give thanks to them for the duty that they perform for us. And we move up. We give thanks to the strawberry, the first hanging fruit that comes out, at least on Turtle Island. We give thanks to that, the leader. From there, we move to the trees. We give thanks to the trees, the main one being the maple and everything that they provide. How's that maple is medicine also. We give thanks to the animals, the four-legged and the ones that fly, and everything that they provide, sustenance. We move to the waters. Give thanks to all the waters, all different levels of the waters, little streams, up to the big lakes, to the oceans. We give thanks for all of that and what they provide for us. And we give thanks to our sustenance, our corn, bean, and squash. We give thanks to them. We give thanks to the winds. So we've completed what's on earth here now. Then we move above. We give thanks to the thunders. Heard them this morning. And the job that they're doing to protect us. We go to the great warrior, the sun, and we give thanks to him providing us heat for us, the sunlight. We go to the moon, Grandmother Moon. We give thanks to her and everything she does for the women and the men. And we give thanks to the Grandmother of the Stars. We give thanks to them too for what they do. We base all of our ceremonies on those stars that we see. And when we're supposed to hold them, hold our ceremonies. From there, we go to Skanyadayo, Handsome Lake. He's the one that brought us, he was a messenger. He's the one that brought us our religion and how we're supposed to be as Unguhowe, as Haudenosaunee. From there, we go to the four protectors. They're the ones that guide us, keep our minds straight, look after us when we're traveling, make sure we get there safe, and we treat each other well. And then we give thanks to Sangwaya Disto. He is our creator that gave us all of this in the natural world. And that's our job, is to respect that and speak for that natural world. So we give thanks to him. So now I've completed my duties as a traditional title holder amongst the Haudenosaunee, amongst the Cayuga Nation. And this will be the last that you hear from me until the states can recognize the Haudenosaunee and all the indigenous nations as an equal, because we've got our own governments and we need to be recognized as such. Nyawa.
Thank you, Chief Deskahay. I hereby declare open the 18th session of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I now have the pleasure to welcome the President of the Human Rights Council, His Excellency Ambassador Jörg Lober. Minister, you have the floor.
Madam Chairperson, distinguished members of the Expert Mechanism, distinguished representatives of indigenous peoples and member states, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I open the 18th session of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I welcome the members of the Expert Mechanism as well as the different delegations attending the sessions as observers. I wish to congratulate Ms. Antonina Gorbunova and Ms. Anexa Alfred Cunningham on their recent reappointment as members of this expert body, and Ms. Valmain Toki for her reappointment as chair. I also welcome Mr. Albert Barume, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Aluki Kotierk, Chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and Ms. Jane Merivas, Member of the Board of Trustees of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. The meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in United Nations processes is crucial in advancing their rights. I warmly welcome all Indigenous representatives, including the 13 beneficiaries of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which celebrate this year its 40th anniversary. I would like to thank the states supporting the fund that allows Indigenous peoples to engage in key United Nations meetings, including this one and the Universal Periodic Review. In this context, I reaffirm the importance of Indigenous peoples being heard at the Human Rights Council and across the broader United Nations system. Their voices carry unique perspectives on self-determination, climate justice, cultural preservation, linguistic rights, access to land and natural resources, and sustainable development. Ensuring that their voices are included in the work of UN bodies is not only a matter of inclusion, but of justice, equity, and respect for the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Human Rights Council is aware of the important work undertaken by the expert mechanism and carefully considers the proposals that it submits for its consideration. It has strongly encouraged all relevant stakeholders, including states and indigenous peoples, to attend and participate actively in the sessions of the expert mechanism, to submit contributions to its studies and reports, and to engage in dialogue with it. The Council has further encouraged all parties to consider the expert mechanism's invitation to country engagements at the request of states and indigenous peoples. This enables the expert mechanism to implement its mandate comprehensively. The participation of indigenous peoples as representatives and institutions in the meetings of the United Nations organs and their subsidiary bodies is essential. This is especially important in bodies that are focused on human rights, such as this Council and its expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. In July and October 2024, the Council came together for 2 intersessional meetings mandated by Resolution 5412. These meetings allowed states, relevant United Nations agencies, funds and programs, international organizations, indigenous peoples from the 7 indigenous social-cultural regions, national human rights institutions and civil society organizations to discuss concrete ways to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the Council's work. I would like to acknowledge the co-facilitators for this process, Australia, Canada, and the indigenous co-facilitator, Mr. Binota Moidamai, and draw your attention to the report and recommendation they have produced jointly with OHCHR. The Human Rights Council has welcomed the expert mechanism's proposal regarding further efforts to facilitate the participation of indigenous peoples and has decided to develop further steps and measures necessary to enable and to facilitate their participation in the Council's work. In addition, the Council has requested me to continue organizing the participation of indigenous peoples from the 7 indigenous social-cultural regions for the interactive dialogues with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and with the expert mechanism. This will be done in consultation with the expert mechanism and with the support of the Office of the High Commissioner as of the 60th session of the Council this September. Distinguished participants, let me now briefly come back to this 18th session of the expert mechanism to highlight the panel discussions taking place this week. Later today, you will review the expert mechanism's work at country level. Throughout the week, you will hold discussions on the role of national and regional human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the declaration. You will also take stock on progress regarding the International Decade on Indigenous Languages. The Council is looking forward to your study and its advice on the rights of indigenous peoples to data, including data collection and disaggregation, a topic with a variety of societal, ethical, and human rights implications. We also look forward to your report on the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional economies, a theme that is essential for cultural preservation, sustainable development, and economic independence. I would like to conclude my remarks by mentioning the very pressing issue of intimidation and reprisals against indigenous peoples as representatives attending United Nations meetings and against United Nations mandate holders working on the rights of indigenous peoples. This Council has condemned the increase in cases of intimidation, harassment, and reprisals against indigenous human rights defenders and indigenous leaders, including indigenous women, as well as indigenous peoples as representatives attending United Nations meetings. I would like to recall that intimidation and reprisals constitute a serious attack, not only against those courageous enough to stand up for human rights, but also against the very essence and proper functioning of the United Nations system itself. I call on everyone, states and others, to respect and protect persons cooperating with and representing the United Nations system. My office will keep a watchful eye over allegations of intimidation and reprisals during this meeting and throughout the year. I wish you all very successful deliberations, and I am looking forward to the continued cooperation between the Human Rights Council and this expert mechanism. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the President of the Council for his remarks and for his encouraging words on the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We look forward to our continuing excellent cooperation with the Human Rights Council as we implement our mandate. I now have the pleasure to welcome the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, His Excellency Volker Turk. High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, Mr. President, members of the expert mechanism, representatives of Indigenous peoples, Excellencies, distinguished participants. I'm really pleased to open the 18th session of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We know how crucial these sessions are to advancing the human rights of Indigenous peoples by focusing on their specific needs and rights and creating momentum for change. And indeed, over the past few years, there have been important developments which promote respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples across the world. For example, Colombia recently formalized Indigenous local governments, granting them authority to oversee budgets and administration within their territories. In Finland, recent legal reforms have strengthened Indigenous self-identification and institutional autonomy. The Guatemalan government holds monthly meetings with Indigenous peoples, leading to several local agreements on territorial claims, among other issues. There's also growing recognition of Indigenous approaches and worldviews. In New Zealand, following the Treaty of Waitangi, certain rivers have been granted legal identity. In South Asia, too, some rivers have specific legal recognition. Likewise, certain mountains and land of significance to Indigenous peoples in various countries have been endowed with rights of their own. And just 2 weeks ago, in an important advisory opinion on states' obligations to protect and restore ecosystems, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights specifically noted that state actions must respect Indigenous knowledge. Despite these advantages, violations against Indigenous peoples remain widespread. Around the world, mining and extractive activities, deforestation and large-scale agricultural exploit and destroy lands and territory without the consent of Indigenous peoples. And many Indigenous peoples still lack formal recognition of land rights, making it harder to defend their territories. Indigenous peoples are also among the most exposed and vulnerable to climate chaos. Droughts, floods, deforestation, and wildfires are destroying the ecosystems that have sustained them for millennia. Across regions, Indigenous peoples face pervasive discrimination in accessing justice, health, education, and other services. Indigenous human rights activists, and you know that very well, continue to face threats and reprisals. According to the data gathered by my office, in 2023 and 24, 26% of defenders who were killed were Indigenous people, largely in the Americas. And I'm very concerned about the widespread impunity for the killings of courageous activists. I urge states to address this immediately by investigating these crimes and prosecuting those responsible. Distinguished participants, digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, are fundamentally reshaping our societies and are having an impact on the Indigenous peoples. On the one hand, AI tools, including speech recognition and translation models, are preserving and reviving Indigenous languages, AI can also support indigenous peoples in monitoring environmental changes to help conserve biodiversity. On the other hand, states are using AI-driven surveillance tools to track and harass indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and we know through information from indigenous communities, including maps and artwork, that this is being used to train AI models without their consent. And indigenous peoples are still largely excluded from key policy decisions on the development of AI. It will be up to all of us to decide how to develop and roll out new technologies to minimize the risks they pose and maximize their potential for good. And if I had one request, it will be so important that within the AI development, that human rights are very central to its development, its use, and the way it's applied. Without human rights guardrails, these rapid developments risk reproducing and entrenching inequalities of our world, including those that are experienced by indigenous peoples. My office is beginning to examine the impact of AI on indigenous peoples, including on the use of indigenous data. And I welcome the study of the expert mechanism that will be presented today, which contains really important recommendations on protecting indigenous people's right to data. Specifically, it highlights that AI must respect indigenous data sovereignty as a component of indigenous people's self-determination and self-governance. In the face of these tremendous challenges, the road ahead will not be easy. We must unite our efforts so that policies and decisions going forward on climate action, on the development of digital technologies and beyond, reflect the wisdom and experience of indigenous peoples. This is not only essential to respect and fulfill the human rights of indigenous peoples, but there is also growing recognition that the ideas and approaches of indigenous peoples hold important lessons for all of us. For example, traditional indigenous practices, including the communal management of forests and fisheries, can mitigate the impact of climate change. More generally, knowledge of the land and respect for the rights of nature are inherent to cultural practices, religions, and traditional laws of many indigenous peoples. This worldview can inspire new models of engagement with our planet, including constitutional recognition that nature and its defenders have legal standing, that there is stronger protection against environmental harm, and recognition of the crime of ecocide, including under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Indigenous peoples can also make clear contributions to climate justice, particularly on the minerals needed for the transition to renewable energy. My office supported indigenous representatives' engagement with the Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals, which, as you know, was issued last year. It's an important report that recommends that human rights be respected where minerals are mined and along the entire value chain. Distinguished participants, I commend the leadership of the Human Rights Council in ensuring the meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, as the President has mentioned. In September 24, it was really a milestone moment for the United Nations. For the first time, indigenous representatives from the Human Rights Council's 7 indigenous social cultural regions addressed a regular session of the Council as direct representatives of their people. And I really hope that other bodies of the United Nations will follow the Council's example. You also mentioned, Mr. President, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples as a key tool for participation. And thanks to the fund, more than 4,000 representatives of indigenous peoples have expressed their views in international processes. But I also need to urge states to strengthen their support to the fund, which faces a critical shortfall, allowing it to support only about 150 of more than 6,000 applicants every year. So 150 out of 6,500 applicants every year. Before I close, I would also like to express my deep concern, which was mentioned by the President of the Council as well, that indigenous peoples continue to face intimidation and reprisals for engaging with the United Nations. This is unacceptable and it must stop. Speaking up should not have to come at the cost of people's safety. And we know how important international meetings like this are. They are a platform for indigenous peoples to raise their concerns, to share their experience and their knowledge. But they are also a space for the international community to listen to the knowledge of indigenous peoples, to their innovative approaches to some of our world's most urgent challenges. I wish you all a very fruitful session and look forward to the outcomes. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the High Commissioner for his statement today. We appreciate the High Commissioner's commitment to the advancement of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And with this, I would like to bring to a close this opening segment and thank all who joined us today. Indigenous representatives, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished experts, let us now proceed with the first item on our agenda, which is the election of officers in accordance with Rule 103 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly. Before doing that, please be reminded that all EMRIP meetings are guided by the highest ethical and professional standards, and all participants are expected to act with integrity and respect towards all participants. We count on your cooperation to ensure that these standards are adhered to by all in this session. I would like to thank each member of the expert mechanism for having entrusted me with the position of chair this past year and for the outstanding collective work that we achieved over the year. I would also like to thank member states, Indigenous representatives and organisations for their openness to dialogue and their continued cooperation with the mechanism in carrying out its mandate. I now invite the expert mechanism to provide a nomination for chairperson rapporteur and for the two vice chairpersons. I recognise expert member Binoto Damai. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, distinguished colleagues, and good morning to all delegations. It's my pleasure and honor to chair this part of the agenda and to present the nomination for chair and vice chair of the expert mechanism. I want to start off by expressing my sincere gratitude to Balmain Toki for her dedication as chair of the expert mechanism in the past year. I then have the pleasure to nominate as chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, Alexa Alfred Cunningham, and as vice chairs, my colleagues Cheryl Lightfoot and Ojot Miro Ojolo. I ask my colleagues if you can accept this proposal. It seems like we have an agreement. So back to the current chair, Balmain Toki.
Thank you, Binotta. In the absence of any objections, it's my privilege to declare Anexa Alfred Cunningham, Chairperson Rapporteur, and Oja Ojulu and Cheryl Lightfoot as Vice Chairperson Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council's Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by acclamation. Please, Anexa, the floor is yours.
Excelencias, Presidente del
Excellencies, President of the Human Rights Council, distinguished representatives of Indigenous peoples, national human rights institutions, UN agencies, and civil society organizations, brothers and sisters.
Adukera, Anahwala Yu Adukera, Tinki Palais. Es un gran honor para mí.
It is a great honor for me to take the floor as the new chair of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Antonina Gurbanova and Valmain Toki on their new appointments. We are delighted to continue working on and progressing on the mandate alongside the two of you. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the continuing members, Daili Sambo, Ojulu, and Cheryl Lightfoot. I would also like to express my gratitude to the work of Binotta Kamai, who has done great work over the past 6 years, and this would be the last of those years. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my distinguished colleagues for the trust that they place in me to serve as chairperson of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This year, and I look forward on working together with all stakeholders. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the mandate of the Expert Mechanism is to give advice to the Human Rights Council and to assist member states and Indigenous peoples to realize the ends of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Before continuing, I would like to point out that the United Nations promotes dialogue and exchanges between different actors with the view to promote sustainable peace, development, and human rights. All participants are encouraged to contribute to EMRIP in a spirit of constructive, robust, multi-stakeholder dialogue, focusing on the theme under discussion. The meetings of the Expert Mechanism, as with any UN system events, are guided by the highest ethical and professional standards. And all participants are expected to behave with integrity and respect towards all participants attending or involved with any meeting of the Expert Mechanism. We count on your cooperation to ensure that the standards are adhered to by all participants at this session. And in this regard, we would like to ask all participants to exercise decorum, to avoid abusive or disrespectful language or derogatory or inflammatory remarks. Otherwise, they might risk permanent prohibition from attending any UN meeting in the future. Allow me now to give you some updates on the work of the expert mechanism over the past year. Despite significant financial constraints, the expert mechanism continued its work in 2024 through its annual session and coordination meetings with other Indigenous mechanisms. The annual intersessional seminar, which is normally a key opportunity for experts and Indigenous peoples to share relevant information, had to be canceled due to liquidity issues. However, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, with financial support of the Christensen Fund, organized a meeting in Chiang Mai, Thailand in mid-December 2024. This meeting contributed valuable input to EMRIP's study. As decided during our 17th session, the expert mechanism has undertaken a study on the rights of Indigenous peoples to data, including with regard to data collection and disaggregation. The draft study will be discussed in depth later on today. This document is available on the Expert Mechanism's 18th Sessions webpage. As mentioned already, in December 2024, the Expert Mechanism held an expert seminar on the topic of the study to provide substantive input to our study on this theme. And the seminar brought together approximately 15 participants with expertise in this field, and that included practitioners from several regions, Indigenous human rights advocates, and members of academia, in addition to members of the expert mechanism. Over the course of these 3 days, panels covered a range of topics such as analysis of legal frameworks, self-determination, sustainable development, data disaggregation, methodological approaches for community-led data collection and analysis, free, prior, and informed consent, artificial intelligence, and Indigenous women. The expert mechanism also hosted a half-day interactive dialogue with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, National Human Rights Institution members, and Indigenous peoples in Thailand. The expert mechanism also carried out several intersessional activities, participated in international seminars, forums, and consultations. Some examples of our very valuable engagements include: 1. Last October's UN Biodiversity Summit held in Cali, Colombia, including the OHCHR press conference on the need for human rights solutions to the biodiversity crisis. Then, secondly, in October, the expert mechanism participated in the FAO Science and Innovation Forum 2024 opening, and notably became a member of the UN FAO Global Indigenous Hub. And third, the expert mechanism participated in November's UN Forum on Biodiversity and Human Rights panel, which focused specifically on Indigenous rights, land rights. And then lastly, fourth, in May of this year, the expert mechanism was represented in a panel during the 26th session of the Working Group on the Right to Development. The expert mechanism continues to actively participate in meetings at the Global Task Force for Making a Decade of Action for Indigenous Languages, as coordinated by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is UNESCO. In 2024, the expert mechanism maintained its dialogues with requesters and member states to make progress in the country engagement. And following a country visit in Norway from the 6th to the 15th of March 2024, we released a technical advisory note on implementing and strengthening the rights of the Indigenous Sami people in March 2025. We will have more information about this topic on a roundtable dedicated to this topic. And over the past year, the expert mechanism has also maintained ongoing coordination with other United Nations indigenous mechanisms, such as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, especially with the participation of the chair in the Human Rights Dialogue and the participation of some EMRIP members during the 24th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Over the last year, there were also a few joint mechanism statements submitted addressing funding and ensuring the full and effective participation of all invited Indigenous peoples to attend. Our annual sessions are yet another example of cooperation between the mechanisms, and I am pleased to welcome Dr. Albert K. Barume, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Ms. Aluki Kotierk, the Chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, and Jane Merwas, who is representing the Board of Trustees of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I would now like to turn to the agenda for this week. Once we complete all these opening formalities, the expert mechanism and all participants will spend part of the day discussing our study, which is entitled Rights of Indigenous Peoples to Data, including data collection and disaggregation. We look forward to receiving your views and feedback on the draft, which we will finalize over the course of this week before its submission to the Human Rights Council at its 60th session, which is scheduled for September. I would like to take this opportunity to announce that the list of speakers for this agenda item is already open and will remain open until 1300 hours today. This item's discussion will continue this afternoon following the lunch. We will devote 2 hours this afternoon to address the expert mechanisms country engagement under item 6. Representatives from member states and indigenous peoples from the most recent country engagement missions will participate in the discussion, and the list of speakers for this item will be opened up today at 1500 hours, and it will close at 1700 hours. One of the highlights of this 18th session will be the panel discussion on the role of national and regional human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the declaration under item 8. And the list of speakers for that agenda item will be open for 1 hour this afternoon, starting at 1700 hours, and then tomorrow it will be open from 10 to 12. On Tuesday afternoon, we will devote 2 hours to our discussion of the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under item 5, and we'll be focusing our discussion on the reports on the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional economies. Unlike the study, this report is concluded and will not be open to changes. However, we would still welcome further feedback and comments. The list of speakers will open from 10 hours to 15:30. On Wednesday morning from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., the expert mechanism will hold a closed-door meeting to discuss and finalize the proposals that were submitted to the Human Rights Council. Following that meeting, we will open up that valuable panel discussion on enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples in the United Nations. And that panel will follow the historical intersessional meetings from last year. The list of speakers for this particular item will be open Tuesday from 5 p.m., 1700 hours, until Wednesday at noon. Then, Wednesday afternoon, we will have an interactive dialogue with a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the representative of the Board of Trustees of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and members of the Human Rights Council. And we are very pleased to welcome once again in this dialogue a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, as we continue strengthening our cooperation with other human rights mechanisms. We look forward to a rich dialogue with all of them. And the list of speakers for this item will open from Wednesday, noon to 1700 hours. Then on Thursday morning, we will have a 2-hour session during which we will be looking at the future work of the expert mechanism, and we will be following up on the thematic studies. The list of speakers for this item will be open for 1 hour on Wednesday from 17 to 1800 hours, and then on Thursday from 10 to 11. For the rest of Thursday, we will hold a discussion on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and the list of speakers will be open on Thursday from 11 a.m. to 1300 hours or 1 p.m. In the late afternoon on Thursday, we will host a private coordination meeting among United Nations Indigenous Rights Mechanism in order to coordinate our work and plan joint initiatives for the period of 2025-2026. And we will wrap up this 4th day with item 11, which will be a discussion on the proposals of the expert mechanism to be made to the Human Rights Council for its consideration and approval in September. Due to financial constraints, we will finish our session Friday at 1300 hours. That is at the end of the morning session on Friday. And then the last half day of this session, the expert mechanism will hold a closed-door meeting to discuss the session report and its proposal. We will end the session also in the morning with the adoption of our 2025 study and advice, our 2025 report, and the annual report on the expert mechanism's work, which will be submitted to the Human Rights Council for its consideration at the 60th session. In addition, there is a very rich program of side events. There are 33 of them in total, and they will be held in person. I would like to encourage all of you to attend these side events, and you can find out what they are and where they are on the webpage. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all those that have contributed to the work of the expert mechanism this past year. In particular, I thank the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, as well as those member states that have made contributions to that fund. The fund has made it possible for 13 Indigenous representatives from all regions of the world to attend this year's session. I would also like to acknowledge and extend a warm welcome to the 40 Indigenous Fellows. 19 of them are women, 20 men, and 1 two-spirited, coming from 26 countries and representing 4 linguistic components: English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. We would also like to acknowledge and extend our gratitude to the Indigenous Peoples Center for Documentation, Research, and Information, known as DOCIP. Thank you for your invaluable contribution supporting and facilitating the participation of Indigenous peoples in our sessions every year. We would also like to extend our gratitude to all member states, Indigenous peoples and their organizations and representative bodies, national human rights institutions, and academia that have contributed to our studies and reports, as well as to all those who have taken an active interest in the implementation of our expanded mandate. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the role of the Indigenous Peoples and Minority Section of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in supporting our work. In closing, I would like to welcome all of you to the 18th session of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. On behalf of my colleagues, I invite you to participate in the discussions and make your contributions, knowing that we are very interested and invested in what you have to share. Your contributions and your views are the foundation for our work moving forward and advocating the rights of Indigenous peoples. Kindly ensure that your contributions this week are directly linked to our working program themes. Our common goal is the full realization of the Declaration and all relevant human rights instruments that aim at improving the enjoyment of the Indigenous peoples of their collective and individual human rights. Thank you. We will now proceed with the adoption of the agenda. With that in mind, I draw the attention of the Expert Mechanisms members to the provisional agenda and its annotations, which are found in document A/HRC/ENRIP/2025/1. Does any member wish to make a statement with regard to the provisional agenda? I see none. May I therefore consider the agenda for the 18th session of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted? It is hereby adopted.
Procedemos ahora.
Let us now proceed with the consideration of the program of work in accordance with Rule 99 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly. You have before you a program of work agreed upon by the members of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This timetable shows the order and distribution of meeting time for each agenda item for the 18th session, according to our adopted agenda.
Ahora vamos a proceder.
And now we will move on to item number 3 on our agenda. And to do that, I would like to welcome our colleague, Voni.
Welcome once again to all participants on behalf of EMRIP, Indigenous Peoples representatives, member states, NGOs, academic institutions, OHCHR, Indigenous fellows and grantees and others. It is indeed my pleasure to chair this session on our draft study on the rights of Indigenous peoples to data, including data collection and data disaggregation. I would like to thank all of those who contributed to this study. Due to the liquidity crisis, the annual mandated intersessional seminar of the expert mechanism was cancelled in 2024. However, I would like to thank the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact for organising an expert seminar in mid-December 2024 in Chiang Mai, Thailand, to support EMRIP's work for this report. And I would like to also warmly thank the Christensen Fund for their financial support, which made it happen. In total, we received contributions and presentations from over 60 stakeholders belonging to Indigenous peoples, states, national human rights institutions, civil society organisations, academics, and others. We are immensely grateful to each and everyone who helped enrich the study, contributing to those valuable insights from grassroots which shaped our analysis of the rights of Indigenous peoples to data. The current study analyses the fundamental human right to data of Indigenous peoples, including data collection and desegregation. It also recognises the right to data as a cultural, strategic, and economic resource anchored in the inherent right to sovereignty and self-determination, which includes Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. The study in front of you analyses the implicit recognition of the right of Indigenous peoples to access and control data related to their lives, cultures, lands, territories, and resources in the existing international legal framework. The majority of articles in the Declaration in various contexts affirm the inherent right, human right, of data autonomy. For instance, non-discrimination in the dissemination of information and the centrality of collecting data for improving social and economic conditions of Indigenous peoples. Regional frameworks such as the 2012 Asian Human Rights Declaration and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other instruments across the UN system also recognise the existing rights to data as an essential feature of human rights that respects, preserves, and protects data and knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples. Some examples are the Convention on Biological Diversity, the WIPO Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources and Traditional Knowledge, and the General Recommendation number 39 on the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So this corpus of international legal framework thus provides primacy to a meaningful and contextually appropriate recognition and safeguarding of various rights of Indigenous peoples to data and self-identification, consent, access and governance of data. The study recognises the historical and contemporary challenges faced by and opportunities available to the Indigenous peoples in realising appropriate access to their data and data autonomy over controlling the collection and use of their personal sensitive data. The study comprehensively lists the major challenges of the right to data through a thematic analysis of the existing domestic legal frameworks and data collection designs. Based on an analysis of legal frameworks of member states, the following are some of the major challenges: legal recognition, the lack of and the denial of Indigenous peoples' existence, cultural legacy and data systems, prioritises colonial indicators. This fails to incorporate Indigenous methodologies and imposes conflicting external classifications. There are variations in defining Indigenous peoples, and disrespect for self-identification complicate accurate data collection, and lack of specific legislation, uniform protocols and training hinders Indigenous peoples' participation in data generation and data management. And also another challenge is that the existing frameworks often do not support Indigenous governance of their data, and big open data practices may further distance them from decision-making processes. Data desegregation by ethnicity or Indigenous status is a key to provide visibility to Indigenous peoples. States often fail to disaggregate data by ethnicity or Indigenous status due to various concerns and insufficient investment in data infrastructure. Gaps, inconsistencies, and lack of coordination in Indigenous peoples' data collection and disaggregation leads to inaccurate data collection, and this, of course, poses a major barrier to that recognition. And Indigenous peoples lack adequate control over their collection, disaggregation, management, and use of their data undermines the key right of self-determination. Despite these existing limitations, the study does include examples of initiatives taken by Indigenous peoples and states to tackle those structural barriers to data governance, which are orientated towards reclaiming data systems to reflect our values, priorities, and rights. The study deeply engages with major thematic issues on the central role of data in furthering the range of rights of Indigenous peoples. So the role of data in achieving the right to self-determination, the role of data regarding decision-making on free, prior and informed consent, the role of data in achieving the right to development, Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, and the impact and role of technology and artificial intelligence in the context of Indigenous peoples' right to data. The study further highlights the central role of women in data as intersecting systemic disadvantages that are exacerbated by the invisibility of women due to the persistent lack of accurate and disaggregated data in their socio-cultural economic condition, through examples from some states acknowledging the urgent need to address such data discrepancies. Our study concludes with the expert mechanism advice number 18, in which we put forward some comprehensive set of measures that Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders can take, including collection, disaggregation, use and protection of data that involves Indigenous peoples, especially women, in every stage of data processes, respecting their self-determination, cultural protocols and knowledge systems. Indigenous data sovereignty should be supported through legal frameworks, Indigenous-led systems and capacity building. Data should be ethically managed and with protections for privacy, sacred knowledge and intellectual property. Collaborative, inclusive practices with governments, civil society and the private sector are key and essential alongside adherence to frameworks like the CARE principles. I would now like to ask the members of the expert mechanism if they have any comments, questions or remarks on the study. Expert member Antonini, you have the floor.
Уважаемые коллеги,
distinguished colleagues, distinguished representatives of Indigenous peoples and states, distinguished chair of the expert mechanism, I'd like to congratulate you on your election and wish you successful work as you chair our work. We also express our gratitude Madam Chair, I would like to congratulate you on your election, wish you full success. I'd like to express my gratitude to the previous chair, Ms. Toki, for her leadership, her expert knowledge, and coordinating our efforts as part of the mandate of the expert mechanisms. I'd like to thank colleagues for our collective work and express my special gratitude to expert Mr. Tamai. Last session, after 2 periods of participating in the expert mechanism, I'd like to refer to the substance of our research related to access to data. Today, we're talking about a cross-cutting issue related to the realization of a broad set of rights of Indigenous peoples. As we see from our research, disaggregating data is not just simply a step that is necessary for monitoring improving policies. It is also a right to collect and store data, analyze data, transfer this data, and submit that data to focus on priorities for development. There's a consensus that data needs to be collected and disaggregated with the full participation of Indigenous peoples. Moreover, their leadership should be ensured in determining the ways and means of dealing with such data. We're pleased that during this session, we'll be holding several parallel events related to leadership of Indigenous peoples, related to data and sovereignty over data and the use of new technologies. And we believe that these events will help us understand better all data-related issues. I'd like to stress our interest, or the interest we saw from groups of Indigenous persons and UN bodies in our report. Today at 1 p.m., under the auspices of the OHCHR, we'll carry out an event related to the link between the right to data and artificial intelligence, and I moderated that event. And as you know, the International Day of Indigenous Persons is devoted to that issue this year, and we invite you to participate in this side event today. We see that it is very important to apply a human rights-based approach and norms of ethics in the use of artificial intelligence as we work with data on Indigenous persons. Our research also focuses on this particular issue in detail. Overall, I personally and in general Indigenous persons of Russia are concerned on how data should be used, collected, and applied in terms of places of worship and traditional knowledge, how the rights of Indigenous peoples can be protected, and when artificial intelligence is applied. There are universal principles and recommendations, but there are always the regional and country context. And I'd like to point out that Indigenous peoples of Russia carried out a seminar in support of our research study with the broad participation of representatives from different parts of the country, parliamentarians, and ombudsmen representing Indigenous peoples. Best practices were shared, current issues and challenges were discussed, as well as future issues, and a collective position was elaborated on how to further promote this work at the national and international level. I also would like to say that this work has helped at the national level promote the fact that Indigenous peoples presented their own system for collecting data, and states are considering this proposal as a foundation for a new monitoring mechanism related to Indigenous people's policies. Madam Chair, data, just like any other discussion of issues here in our meetings, requires full participation of Indigenous peoples from all regions of the world without any discrimination. In this respect, I'd like to express my serious concern with existing and remaining visa restrictions that are applied against our sisters and brothers. For example, Hani Mohani, a member of the forum, was unable to participate in the meeting of the forum this year. In another situation, another member of the expert mechanism, Mr. Sigtam, was not able to participate in this session because of visa requirements. Many recommendations and resolutions of the Human Rights Council related to the visa restrictions have been developed, and it's very difficult to talk about the broad participation of representatives of Indigenous peoples in our forum. And this is a key issue for different countries where the UN organizations are presented. Any visa requirements, delays in presenting visas, and creating obstacles in the participation of our mechanism carried out by Switzerland and other countries is something that should be considered. This may create obstacles in terms of the different international agreements that exist. For example, the Schengen Agreement. Participation in international cooperation is one of the rights of Indigenous peoples, and this is why the expert mechanism has issued a joint statement appealing to states to comply with their international obligations and to not create any restrictions on the participation of Indigenous persons in international events on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Colleagues, sisters and brothers, in conclusion, I'd like to wish everyone full success in your work, and we do hope that this will be yet another step in promoting dialogue and creating future work in the promotion of the rights of Indigenous persons and implementing the objectives and goals of the Declaration, and create a safe space for open dialogue and the promote of the items on our agenda in the work of the expert mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonina, for your comments. Are there any other members, expert members, that would like to take the floor? Daly, please.
To congratulate our sister Anexa and look forward to your leadership in the coming days, weeks, months. Just very quickly on the study, I just wanted to indicate that in the context of completing an initial draft on a project that we're doing with the Lancet entitled Urgently Accelerating Indigenous Health and Wellbeing, the Lancet Commission on Arctic and Northern Health. One of the conclusions that was made was the fact that a lack of data actually prohibits adding specific Indigenous peoples' context to important areas. And I just underscore the fiduciary obligation of governments to provide health care. And if you lack the specific Indigenous context because you lack the data, it has very, very serious consequences. That particular report will come out following the peer review by the Lancet, but it is just one conclusion as well as recommendation made through this particular report that is specific to data. The second quick comment is that I took the commentary by the High Commissioner for Human Rights very seriously concerning artificial intelligence. I think that we should carefully review and heed the calls that he made in relation to the benefits, but then also the serious risks in relation to artificial intelligence, which is moving rapidly, even more rapidly than we can manage to keep up. So those are the only comments on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daly, for your comments. Are there any other members of the expert mechanism who'd like to take the floor? The Permanent Forum, would any members of the Permanent Forum like to take the floor? Okay, Special Rapporteur. Okay. We will now turn to the speakers list on this item. We'd very much appreciate your feedback on the draft study and advice as we seek to finalise the study before submitting it to the 57th session of the Human Rights Council. We encourage you to, if you can, directly address the text of the study during your interventions. Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor now to Shineko Okikawa from ACSILS.
Hi, my name is
Shineko, are you in the room?
Hello. Hi, my name is Shinako Yakawa. I'm an Indigenous Ryukyuan from Okinawa. Despite the fact of Committee on Elimination Racial Discrimination and many other UN bodies have recognized the recommended the Japanese government recognize the Ryukyuan people as indigenous people and protect our rights. As of today, we are still not recognized as indigenous peoples. As a result, the rights of indigenous people ensured in EMRIP, for which Japan voted in favor of, are not being upheld in our lands and for our peoples. We are facing the ongoing problem of water contamination caused by the US and Japan military bases. Last year, we submitted a report on how the present military bases has impacted on our lives. Subsequently, Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Waste Marcus Oriana paid an informed visit in Ryukyu, Okinawa, inspected the site of water contamination, PFAS, and then held a symposium with Okinawa Prefectural government. However, because of the government does not recognize us indigenous people, we are unable to collect data on the health impacts we indigenous people are facing. Without recognition on our island's identity and the health situation of our people or collective cannot be assessed, and the problems of the instead of view as a regional issue as attributed to individual lifestyle choice. Furthermore, since 70% of U.S. military facilities in Japan are concentrated in Okinawa, sexual violence by U.S. military personnel, Asian, indigenous women, and children occur repeatedly. It was revealed that even though the U.S. military share the incident data with the Japanese government, it doesn't share it with the Okinawa prefectural government. This means that we indigenous people cannot even grasp the true extent of sexual violence on our islands. As a result, we are unable to adequately support victims in terms of medical care or legal protections. In many cases, due to the barriers of the states of force agreement, even when victims do not forward the foot of protection is low, and victims are left without justice. We believe that indigenous Ryukyuan people needs to conduct on our own data collection for by indigenous people. And we ask for Japanese government to respect for UNDRIP, and then also the Osaka High Court acknowledgement that Ryukyuan people are indigenous. We call for Japan and the US government to cooperate in this effort. Thank you very much. Nife Debiru.
I thank you for your intervention. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Christian Carpenter from the Native American Rights Fund.
Distinguished Chair, members, and delegates. Thank you for the opportunity to address you on behalf of the Implementation Project, a joint initiative of the Native American Rights Fund and the University of Colorado Law School in the United States. The project works collaboratively with American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians on education and advocacy to implement the Declaration. We congratulate the chair on her election and EMRIP on an excellent draft study. Indigenous data is, of course, the embodiment and expression of Indigenous lifeways and critical to self-determination. In that spirit, we would like to suggest 2 changes to the draft. First, we recommend that the study address the need to remedy past appropriations of Indigenous peoples' knowledge and data. Leading scholars have noted the appropriation of Indigenous peoples' data, like their land and resources, is not just a concern for the future. For hundreds of years, scientific, academic, and corporate actors have been taking Indigenous peoples' knowledge in the realms of medicine, language, law, and religion. Such knowledge now sits in universities, laboratories, and archives where Indigenous peoples themselves cannot freely access it, even to hear the voices of their ancestors or relearn traditional ways lost to them through the forces of colonization. Articles 8, 11, 12, and 13 of the Declaration, among others, call for remedial actions with respect to such appropriation. EMRIP made these points in its previous study on repatriation of ceremonial objects, human remains, and intangible resources, and we recommend that the current study also call for the return of data previously taken from Indigenous peoples and to ensure access to these forms of data while still held in non-Indigenous collections. Second, we welcome EMRIP's advice on the new WIPO treaty. We suggest 2 edits consistent with the positions of the Indigenous caucus at WIPO. Our recommended language for advice number 22 is states should become parties to the World Intellectual Property Organization Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge, and create, in consultation with Indigenous peoples, appropriate database safeguards and transparent modalities for disclosing and exchanging data from databases across borders. Thank you very much and have a terrific session.
Thank you, Kristen, for your intervention. I'd now like to give the floor to Mr. Igor Barinov from the Russian Federation.
Уважаемая госпожа председатель.
Distinguished Madam Chair, the Russian Federation shares the position on the importance of the right of indigenous peoples to disaggregated data. We praise the efforts of the expert mechanism to broaden awareness of this issue. We studied carefully the relevant study of the expert mechanism and the collective report of the biggest organizations of indigenous peoples of Russia. We're convinced that disaggregated data are extremely important, not just for indigenous peoples, but also for states. It is clear that the lack of such data reduces the overall effectiveness of policy of states in terms of indigenous peoples and doesn't make it possible to carry out an objective assessment of the situation. In comparison with the overall situation in Russia, we have seen the development of federal and regional statistics on indigenous peoples. However, official statistics usually contains general data and cannot cover all important disaggregated indicators. This information can be collected at the level of agencies if the state creates the necessary legal and organizational conditions. In this respect, we support the collective proposal of umbrella organizations of indigenous peoples of Russia on the need to have by the state disaggregated indicators on their social economic situation. Organizations of indigenous persons have submitted to the federal agency on the questions of nationalism of Russia a basic set of indicators. The preliminary analysis of this proposal by federal and regional authorities that are responsible for the realization of the rights of indigenous persons reaffirm the possibility of collection of such data and practical implementation. We considering the possibility of creation of automated data systems for the processing of such information. Will continue to strive for the legal consideration and acceptation of such indicators and the creation on the basis of such indicators a system of monitoring of social economic situation of indigenous persons, as well as establishment of plans of activities related to the realization of the federal concept note on the sustainable development of indigenous peoples. This will make it possible to carry out an objective analysis of the conditions of the situation of indigenous persons. We believe that the creation of a standard of disaggregated indicators that reflects the efforts of states on creation of legal and financial mechanisms for the factual realization of the rights of indigenous persons is highly timely. Also at the level of the United Nations, this will increase the responsibility of states that very often just create a semblance of a legal recognition of the rights of indigenous persons. And I'd like to thank the expert mechanism for a quality research study. Thank you.
Their intervention. I now give the floor to Mr. Rosero from the Organización Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas de la Amazonia Colombiana. Sorry for pronunciation. You have the floor. OPIAC.
Puangi Tukuikunamanda, muy buenos días para todos.
Good morning to all of you. My name is Shafnu Naroy, coordinator for OPIAC. Today, I would like to talk about the urgent necessity for protection of our sisters and brothers in South America. The reality is quite alarming. There are at least 188 indigenous groups in isolation. Only 60 of them are officially recognized by states. This leaves more than 120 peoples invisible, without rights, without protected territory, and without defense against invasion. Today, many of these peoples face real threats. The Amazon, the jungle itself are being devastated by illegal activities, for example, logging, drug trafficking, illegal mining. And these illegal economies are, in fact, a slow death of these peoples related to violence and diseases. The sources of water are being contaminated and forcing displacement of the space and breaking the social and environmental balances, exposing them against bacteria and diseases that they do not have any defenses. This right to exist in isolation, their self-determination, is violated on a daily basis. For this, we need data to protect. And data is a proof of their existence and a foundation for the defense. Information makes it possible to delineate intangible areas and develop public policies and activate prevention protocols, becoming a legal shield. The lack of contact creates maximum pressure on the free determinations, and we need to establish strict limits and avoid interactions that may lead to diseases and conflicts. This is an active strategy for protection of territory of culture and requires constant monitoring and combating different threats. In this way, recognize the system of traditional knowledge, which is a source of effective and vital information. This existence is not negotiable. It's a legal and ethical imperative, reflecting the strong commitment of states. And we need to make recommendations to states that are robust with binding measures to safeguard the lives and the future of Indigenous peoples in isolation. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Tony Chanan from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. On behalf of Asia Indigenous Peoples Caucus, we thank the EMRIP study for affirming Indigenous peoples' rights to data as a fundamental right linked to self-determination and development. It highlights the need for Indigenous control over the collection, ownership, and the use of data, recognizing data as a cultural, strategic, and economic resource. The study notes positive frameworks like the 2012 ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, which supports Indigenous knowledge and data systems. However, ongoing developments such the draft ASEAN Declaration on Environmental Rights have excluded Indigenous peoples, undermining UNDRIP commitments. A major challenge identified is the lack of legal recognitions of Indigenous peoples and their collective rights, with many states denying their identity and failing to implement UNDRIP. Tools like the Indigenous Navigator provide Indigenous-led data collection to monitor the implementations of Indigenous peoples' rights. It is essential to strengthen the support for Indigenous peoples and their organizations and their initiatives. Despite the critical role of data in achieving self-determination, development, and informed consent, most Asian governments do not recognize Indigenous peoples or their data sovereignty. There is still no comprehensive data documentation on human rights violations against Indigenous peoples in Asia. Even as the trend of such violations continues to increase each year. Moreover, the rise of artificial intelligence and digitalization further threatens the Indigenous knowledge systems due to the lack of safeguards. We urge the UN and member states to implement EMRIP's recommendations and ensure Indigenous people's rights to data through legal recognition, disaggregated data collection, and full participations. The United Nations expert and other mechanisms should take the urgent action on the following recommendation. Urge the UN mechanism to actively encourage UN member states to incorporate the provisions of UNDRIP into national laws and policies, and to support the concrete measures that ensure the effective implementations of Indigenous people's rights to data and full realizations of UNDRIP. Urge states to collect this aggregated data on Indigenous peoples with their full and effective participations with respect for their rights to self-determination and self-governance. Urge the states to legally recognize and respect the Indigenous people's sovereignty over their knowledge and data, and to provide protection against external individuals and entities seeking to acquire intellectual property rights over Indigenous knowledge. Urge states to protect and respect the defensive strategies of Indigenous peoples and their communities in safeguarding secret cultural manifestation, including sacred knowledge, symbols, and traditional words. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Mr. Rodrigo Pintado from Mexico.
Antes que nada, permítame felicitar.
At the outset, I would like to congratulate Ms. Cunningham on her election to preside over the work of the 18th session of this expert mechanism, and we thank you for presenting the report. On behalf of the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, I would like to share with you and with the mechanism that on July 12th, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, during its 47th session, granted Mexico the inscription of the Wixárika route through the sacred sites to Wirikuta on the World Heritage List. It is an indigenous pilgrimage route that extends along a biocultural corridor of 500 kilometers. It was given the distinction as a serial acid for being one of the most representative pre-Hispanic routes still in use in America, something that constitutes an exceptional testimony of the living cultural traditions of the Wixárika people. I'm also pleased to share with you that in Mexico we have a national catalog of indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples, the first instrument of the Mexican state to fully identify peoples and above all indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities as subjects of public law, and to guarantee the exercise of their collective rights recognized as such by the constitutional reform to Article 2, signed by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador on 30 September 2024, something that is also recognized in national and international legislation. The catalog was created on the basis of information provided by the traditional and community authorities themselves, presented for their registration, systematization, and subsequent publication. Currently, 16,114 communities, out of them 15,600 indigenous, 444 Afro-Mexican, and 70 pluricultural communities, with information on their political, economic, and social and cultural institutions. The catalog is publicly accessible and represents a watershed for the construction of public policies, including public information repositories or continuous monitoring systems to collect data on human rights violations, such as discrimination, forced displacement, lack of access to basic service, gender-based violence, among others. Finally, this is a historical and unprecedented event. As of this year, by constitutional mandate and with the decisive support of the first woman president of Mexico, Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum, the indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities registered in the catalog receive and directly exercise and implement public resources to carry out works decided by their assemblies, thus exercising their legal recognition as subjects of public law.
I thank the representative from Mexico for your intervention. I now give the floor to Thomas Aslak from the Sami Parliament in Finland. Thomas, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, I thank the expert mechanism for this important and timely study. I'm speaking in my capacity as acting president on behalf of the Sami Parliament in Finland. In our context, the Sami Parliament has adopted a procedural based on the principles on free, prior and informed consent and the Akvakon guidelines. This procedure safeguards Sami cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, ensuring that any research or activity that may affect our communities requires written consent from the Sami Parliament and, where applicable, from the Sami community or the called Sami village meeting. This consent is not symbolic. It is rooted to the respect for Sami ownership, collective rights, and the rights to control our data. We emphasize that consent must be based on full, accurate information on the purpose, methods, risks, and expected benefits of the activity, and must allow adequate time for the community review. We urge states and researchers to adopt and apply ethical and right-based approaches like these. Indigenous data governance cannot achieve without respecting our FPIC, enabling participation in the design, execution, and analysis of data projects, and recognizing that we have the right to say no. We further recommend EMRIP to encourage member states to follow on their commitment to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document, operative paragraph 10, where states have made commitments to work together with indigenous peoples to better disaggregate data. In light of the recent achievements in Finland on legislative level, I hope we will answer to the challenges of lack of statistical and other kind of information of the Sami people together with the government of Finland. In conclusion, we echo the expert mechanism advice. Indigenous peoples must not only be counted, we must count on being respected, heard, and control of our own data. Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you, Thomas, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Jon from FAO.
Distinguished delegates, elders, fellows, leaders, and experts. FAO congratulates Anexa Cunningham as chair of ENRIP and thanks Balmaine Toki for her work. Indigenous peoples' rights to collection and disaggregation of data is critical to advance in the implementation of UNDRIP. It's critical for indigenous peoples, countries, and UN, and is fundamental to support indigenous peoples' food and knowledge systems. FAO, as part of its normative work and to inform evidence-based policy decisions and programs, has been working to overcome the lack of data and statistics on food security. We remain concerned about the forced invisibility it imposes on indigenous peoples. FAO publishes annually the report on the status of food insecurity, SOFI. This flagship publication influences decisions and policies, and it has not included so far the indigenous peoples. Why? Because of lack of national disaggregated data. Historically, indigenous peoples have been excluded from most national data systems affecting the effectiveness of policies and programs. To overcome this, FAO would like to collaborate with the 3 UN mechanisms on indigenous peoples, indigenous researchers, and partners. Let me provide 4 updates that could provide opportunities to collaborate with ENRIP. For the first time in its history, the World Committee on Food Security, CFS in English, in 2026 will discuss indigenous peoples' food systems. This provides us all with a strategic opportunity for policy discussions with the countries. The FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit joined a WHO-FAO task force with National Statistics Commissions on Nutrition and Food. They accepted our proposal of including as a unit of measurement the community, based on the work by the Indigenous Navigator and the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. The FIAS methodology is an opportunity for indigenous peoples to reinforce their data sovereignty. Our unit supports indigenous peoples interested in using the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, or FIAS, to measure the resilience of their food systems. In Central America and Northeast India, indigenous peoples have applied this methodology in their own communities. We offer training to any indigenous peoples who would like to manage this methodology in their community-led research. With IDGIA, we are refining the first draft of a global publication looking into the nutrition, food security, right to food, and food sovereignty of indigenous peoples. We would like to work with ENRIP to finalize and publish this global report ahead of the policy discussions at the World Committee on Food Security in 2026. We look forward to collaborating with you all on data sovereignty and disaggregated statistics against the invisibility that affects the rights of indigenous peoples. In this regard, the October meeting this year in Rome of the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems is an important opportunity to strategize together in this direction. Thank you for the use of the word.
Thank you, Jon, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Ms. Eva Gavrilova from the European Union.
Distinguished members of the expert mechanism, distinguished indigenous representatives. In the context of the debate on indigenous data, the European Union underscores its unwavering commitment to the rights of indigenous peoples as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and International Human Rights Law. While data is not mentioned explicitly in the declaration, it is implicitly covered in a number of paragraphs. Data are cultural, strategic, and economic resources, the importance of which cannot be underestimated. The EU has developed a comprehensive framework of policies and regulations related to data ownership, collection, access, use, and disaggregation. These policies aim to protect individual rights, promote innovation, and ensure fair competition in the digital economy. Our General Data Protection Regulation emphasizes data subject rights, including consent, access, and control principles, relevant in the context of discussion of indigenous data as well. In its social and digital policies, for example, under Equality Data Initiative, the EU promotes digital policies. The EU promotes disaggregation of data so that the diversity of situations can be captured and analyzed for equitable policymaking. The EU Data Governance Act seeks to boost data sharing by regulating data intermediaries and by encouraging the sharing of data for altruistic purposes. The EU is proud to provide financial support to launch and expand the Indigenous Navigator. It is a set of tools for Indigenous peoples to systematically monitor the level of recognition and implementation of their rights. The Indigenous Navigator recognizes the need for Indigenous peoples to own and manage the data that they collect and reinforces that they are rightful owners of those data as a tool for governing themselves and their lands, territories, and resources. The data and knowledge can be used as a powerful tool to engage with authorities to advocate for policies that respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Could the expert mechanism share remaining challenges as well as good practices in using artificial intelligence to collect and analyze data of Indigenous peoples to their benefit? I thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Janelle Dimas from Potikanga National Iwi Leaders Forum.
Tēnā tātou. I am speaking as Potikanga for the National Iwi Chairs Forum of Aotearoa, a collective of more than 80 Indigenous nations across Aotearoa, New Zealand. First of all, we commend the expert mechanism for its focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples to data and acknowledge the preparation of the draft study. We recognise contributions made by Indigenous networks globally. For iwi Māori, the right to data is inseparable from the right to rangatiratanga, to sovereignty, over our ability to make decisions for and by ourselves, grounded in our own Indigenous laws, whakapapa, and intergenerational obligations. In Aotearoa, Māori have long advocated for Indigenous data sovereignty, and we recognise that this has been noted in the study. This means not only having access to disaggregated data, but also exercising control over how data about us is defined, collected, governed, and used. Too often, data is used as a tool of control rather than partnership. Agencies collect, analyse, and interpret Māori data through frameworks that are not ours, reinforcing deficit narratives and making decisions about our futures without our authority. This continues a legacy of not honouring the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through new digital and bureaucratic means. With relevance to the Aotearoa context, the NICF affirms the following principles. Firstly, that data sovereignty is a preemptive right affirmed through Te Tiriti o Waitangi and recognised through the UNDRIP. This includes the rights of iwi and hapu to govern data relating to our people, lands, and resources. Tikanga, that is Indigenous law, must guide Indigenous data governance. For us, data is not just information. As mentioned in the study, data is our stories. It is a taonga to us. It is a treasure that carries spiritual, cultural, and relational significance, and it must be handled with that same care as other sacred knowledge. And that global standards must reflect Indigenous realities. We support international frameworks like the CARE principles that have been noted in the study, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, but we also urge that these be interpreted through our own Indigenous worldviews and protocols. We recommend that the final study affirm the rights of Indigenous people to govern, protect, and mobilise our own data, recognise data as a foundational pillar of self-determination development and institution building. And then we recommend that states support Indigenous-led data systems, including the transfer of control over data infrastructures and definitions. Finally, we emphasize that data without context can be harmful. Stripped from our histories, values, and lived realities, it can be misinterpreted.
Ngā mihi, Janelle. I now give the floor to Amina Amrarik from the Akol El Hajib. Amina, you have the floor.
Madame la Présidente, ceci est une...
This is a joint statement bringing together 6 organizations.
Assistant.
Distinguished assistants. Since 1912, the Amazigh Morocco are facing a systemic removal of their land, territory, and natural resources, and many laws approved in 2019, similar to colonial laws, as well as Law 113, which are an expression of a removal policy that impacts Amazighs harshly and continuously pushes them into poverty. The official bulletin of the 16th of June 2025 points to the effective creation of 8 national parks on the territory of the kingdom, taking over the collective lands of this Amazigh population, altering their ancestral ways of living, increasing the levels of extractive activities in areas rich in minerals. These policies and activities run against Article 8 of the Convention on Biodiversity, which they pay no heed to, as they do not respect the communities, their rights, and interests. Yet another problem is the privatization, which, according to the terms of reference of the MCA Morocco project, seeks to spur the market to benefit national and international investors, paying no heed to the interest of the Amazigh. Recommendations. The state must abolish all colonial laws or colonially inspired laws leading to the removal of land from their Amazigh owners, and to restitute collective land to the right holders, and to provide redress to those that have lost their land. Also, to effectively respect free, prior, and informed consent of the Amazigh as citizens in full rights, having social, economic, and political rights under the United Nations Charter and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Guangcheng from AIPP.
Thank you, Chair. I speak on behalf of the Indigenous Navigator Consortium. We welcome this important study on the right of Indigenous peoples to data, including data collection and disaggregation, and commend the expert mechanism for its work. Despite the adoption of the UNDRIP and other binding treaty obligations, many states continue to fall short in recognizing and implementing our rights. Our critical gap lies in the lack of robust, disaggregated, and Indigenous-owned data that reflects the lived realities of our communities. Article 1 specifically recognizes our right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage and intellectual property, including data. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent must therefore apply to all data-related activities concerning Indigenous peoples. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has consistently emphasized the need for disaggregated data and full Indigenous participation in the stages of data collection. Yet, many states lack data system or actively resist disaggregation of official data on ethnicity or Indigenous origin. Moreover, data is too often collected without our consent and misused and misappropriated. To address this, the Indigenous Navigator offers a human rights-based framework developed by and for Indigenous peoples. It enables communities to generate and own quality data and engage in evidence-based dialogue with authorities. This data has been instrumental in Indigenous-led monitoring of the UNDRIP, the ILO Convention number 169, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Based on the experiences of the Indigenous navigator, we therefore wish to highlight the following. The states must recognize Indigenous peoples' right to data sovereignty, including control over collection, ownership, and the use of data concerning us. This aggregated data should be collected in partnership with Indigenous peoples, reflecting our identities and priorities. Free, prior, and informed consent must be obtained for all data initiatives in line with Article 19 of the UNDRIP. And states and UN agencies should support Indigenous-led data initiatives, such as the Indigenous Navigator, through sustained funding and capacity building. Indigenous peoples must be equal partners in all status of data governance, with particular attention to the inclusion of Indigenous women and youth. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gonchal, for your intervention. Much appreciated. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Valiria Choinova from the Indigenous Peoples of Russia Foundation.
Thank you, Chair. This year, EMRIP focuses on Indigenous data sovereignty. As the draft study states, Indigenous peoples have the right to Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous governance in respect of Indigenous data, as an expression of the inherent sovereignty and overarching right to self-determination. I speak as an Indigenous Sakha activist from the Russian Federation, where this right is not recognized and its absence has real material consequences for our peoples. In Russia, Indigenous peoples are denied meaningful control over how data about us is collected, used, and shared. There is no national census category that reflects Indigenous status. Russia denies the recognition of Indigenous peoples if their population exceeds 50,000. This denial of our identity prevents us from accessing rights and services and erases us from national development plans and public statistics. The principle of self-identification is not respected, and we are treated not as distinct peoples with collective rights, but as ethnic minorities without sovereignty. At the same time, we do not have access to the data that concerns us, especially around extractive projects on our lands. In my home region, the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, over 73% of Russia's diamonds, 53% of its uranium, and 12% of its gold are extracted. Yet we have no say and no data on the environmental and health impacts. We don't know the full extent of the destruction because there is no independent monitoring. This violates both our rights to know and our right to give or withhold free, prior, and informed consent. In places like the Evenki village of Tina, Indigenous peoples have documented forest loss, poisoned water, and dying reindeer due to the expansion of mining by the Russian-British company Nordgold. When they spoke out, they were labeled foreign agents. The leader of the nomadic community, Arsenty Nikolai, was falsely charged with extortion and died soon after. Stepan Pakhomov, a traditional hunter, was imprisoned for practicing his way of life and later died in Ukraine after being pressured to join the Russian army. These are not isolated cases. They are part of a larger system of state centralization, denial of self-determination, and data control. My people are not recognized as subjects in decision-making. Data becomes a tool of extraction, extortion, and persecution. I urge EMRIP to continue its work on Indigenous data sovereignty and recognize the challenges of Indigenous peoples in authoritarian contexts where the denial of data is part of the denial of rights. When we talk about Indigenous people's right to data, just solutions are possible only when we recognize and name colonial approaches. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Mr. Juan Leon from the International Indian Treaty Council.
Señora Presidenta, el Consejo. Thank you. The International Indian Treaty Council would like to thank the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and their Study of data. Data is a strategic instrument for states and indigenous peoples themselves to be well informed and take the best decisions on how to draft and enforce public policies in order to develop their lives according to their worldview, to have infrastructure, production, means of trade, to protect ceremonial centers, to develop their own systems. All of this can be used to show that human rights are being protected and that indigenous peoples are enjoying their rights. However, for data gathering among indigenous peoples, it is indispensable that there be transparency and goodwill from governments, that there be total openness so that indigenous peoples have full, effective participation in the design and implementation of these instruments in order to reduce the possibility of having wrong data or results that violate the rights of indigenous peoples. Additionally, it would be best if it is the indigenous peoples themselves who design and implement these systems without meddling of states or private interests, but using available financial resources. And as the report says, with the full, free determination with self-government of indigenous peoples. We would like to suggest that the mechanism broaden the study on the rights of indigenous people to data, specifically as regards collecting the data, and that they should hold two specific activities. First, to put together a database on indigenous peoples using coming from all states and indigenous peoples, that they prioritize key components for collective lives and the rights of these people. And two, to hold at least 2 workshops in 2026 with various representatives and authorities of indigenous peoples in order to talk about the experiences on data gathering. Chair, is there a possibility to create a mechanism to empower indigenous peoples as they try to develop instruments to gather their own data according to their own worldview and their right to free determination? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Ms. Jannik Gratsud from Norway.
Thank you, Chairperson. The draft study by the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples raised many challenging and important issues, such as the legitimate desire of indigenous peoples to access data about their own communities. A key challenge is data protection as a result of self-identification and voluntary self-reporting. Allow me to share some experiences and practices on data collection and disaggregation in Norway. It is a strong and widely supported principle in Norway that individuals should not be registered by the state unless it's clearly necessary and for a legitimate cause. My country has a long-standing official policy of not recording citizens' race and ethnicity, rooted in historical misuse of such registration. Since much of personal statistics are register-based, there is no general data foundation for creating individual-based statistics on people with Sami ethnic affiliation in Norway. We do, however, have some relevant knowledge regarding the Sami. One example. Statistics Norway produces official statistics on the Sami every 2 or 3 years. Statistics Norway has chosen not to advocate for self-reporting and expanded use of existing registers, believing that it should emerge as a desire and initiative from the Sami communities themselves. A second, in Norway, the National Population Register produces statistics on the number of people using Sami languages based on people who have registered as users of one or more Sami languages. Relying on voluntary registering of language proficiency or ethnic status risks bias in data and the validity of the resulting analyses. This situation makes sociological research and public health studies, such as Saminor, more important. Saminor is a large population-based health and living conditions survey. It is one of the most important sources of knowledge about the health and living conditions of the Sami and Northern Norwegian populations. Together, the Sami Parliament and the government have appointed the Expert Analysis Group for Sami Statistics, who publishes an annual report featuring the annotated Sami statistics. The report contributes to increased knowledge on Sami language, culture, and society that can be used by the government and the Sami Parliament in Sami policy work in Norway. Open data is another important policy principle, which must be balanced with the value of indigenous control. This is an open debate among Sami and other indigenous academics, and we welcome the dialogue on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Mr. Ida Fathi from the Tamainguk NGO.
Madam Chair, distinguished experts, I'm Fathi Idar, Amazigh from Morocco, speaking on behalf of the Tamainut organization. We sincerely thank UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People for their generous support. So, in 2024, the High Commission for Planning of Morocco conducted a national population and housing census. Unfortunately, this process was discriminatory against Amazigh people, especially in how language was treated. The Amazigh language was excluded from the questionnaires, the training of census workers, and the public awareness campaigns. Many Amazigh-speaking citizens were unable to respond in their language. Others reported speaking Arabic instead, either out of confusion or because they feared their language will not be recognized. As a result, there was massive underreporting, and the official data claimed that only 25% of the population speak Amazigh and just 1% are fully proficient. These numbers are strongly contested. Even if we accept these numbers as accurate, they are still deeply worrying. They reflect the result of over 60 years of Arabization policies that pushed Amazigh language and identity to the margins. Recent government efforts to introduce Amazigh in education have also largely failed in practice. The census violates several key obligations. It goes against Article 5 and Article 19 of the UNDRIP. It also violates Article 31 and Article 5 of the Moroccan Constitution and Article 1 of the ACCPR and the goals 16 and 17 of the CDJ, which require inclusive data and accountable institutions. We call for an independent review of the 2024 census to clarify or eliminate any basis regarding the Amazigh population representation. The full integration of the Amazigh language in all data collection tools, a linguistic reparation plan with positive and differentiated treatment of Amazigh, the recognition of indigenous people's right to control, access, and use their own data in line with self-determination. Tanbert.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to the Shiman Gaiko Centre, the Citizens Diplomatic Centre for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
We would like to raise to concerning lack of access of data related to the activities taking place on the indigenous land of Ain. First, the Ain people was not informed about the construction of a nuclear transport port near the Tomari nuclear power plants or the exploration of methane hydro resources in Yaum Moshiri. This violates free, prior, and informed consent under Articles 19 and 19 of the UNDRIP. Second, between 31st January and 9th February 2025, the Japanese government conducted joint military exercise with the United States Army. This violates Article 30, paragraph 1 of the UNDRIP, which prohibits military activity in indigenous lands or territories unless freely agreed to or requested by indigenous peoples concerned. Therefore, we respectfully call upon EMRIP to urge the government of Japan to take the following actions in accordance with the UNDRIP. First, accessibility, ethics and transparent mechanism to enforce the indigenous people's access to issue data and full participation in decision-making process. Second, immediately cease and prohibits all military activities on the indigenous land without free, prior, and informed consent. Thank you. Yera Ikere.
Thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Sandra Miriam Del Carmen Ceballos from the Association de Mujeres Abogadas Indigenous. Sandra, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora coach.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. We thank the expert mechanism for the work carried out in line with paragraph 36 of the study on the right of indigenous peoples to data, especially the collection and disaggregation of the data. The Republic of Argentina is mentioned because of a good practice related to 2022 census had a question related to self-identification of indigenous peoples and the peoples that they belong to. Nevertheless, this led to some criticisms from indigenous and organizations of indigenous peoples, and the critics focused on the methodology of the census and the lack of the participation of indigenous peoples in the design and execution. The organizations of indigenous peoples said they were not consulted and they could not participate in the design of the census. That led to different questions on the relevance of the questions and the methodology that was used. The question on self-identification was indeed sufficient to see the diversity of indigenous people because belonging to a group based on a broader concept. So that limited the questions. And also the census was not in a position to fully assess the situation of indigenous people living in urban areas. So the questions were focused on rural communities, and this way making invisible those communities that moved to cities, and also the spread of indigenous persons was necessary in order to ensure that census cover all indigenous peoples, including those that do not know the state language. And they need specific and intercultural public policies to guarantee the implementation of the rights to distribute wealth and combat racism and discriminations. Now, if those tools disappear or if inequalities do not find a reflection in public policies, we cannot do much to step up our efforts to combat any forms of discrimination. This is why I would like to urge the state of Argentina, the strength, the position of institutions that work with indigenous peoples and ensure that the recommendations become cross-cutting for all bodies of the state, and to ensure the full participation of indigenous peoples in the elaboration of public policies on the basis of robust data in the future census that'll be carried out. The results obtained in this way will make it possible to have relevant data to contribute to the free determination of indigenous peoples in line with the normative framework that exists at the national and international levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Ms. Ingrid Green from the Ontario Native Women's Association.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ingrid Green. I am here from the Ontario Native Women's Association. We are here amplifying the collective voices of over 35 Indigenous women's agencies. Aligned with CDAW General Recommendation 39, we are pleased to see a specific section on the role of Indigenous women in data and that some of UNWA's recommendations were included in the expert mechanism's advice. We are also pleased to see calls to implement Indigenous governance data frameworks by member states. In Canada, this includes First Nations principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, IQ principles, and other community-specific mechanisms, including an Indigenous gender-based lens. UNWA offers our support for the study. We call for EMRIP to consider 3 edits to strengthen it. Prioritize Indigenous women's sovereignty and governance of our data, call for states to invest in Indigenous women's organizations, acknowledge that Indigenous data governance structures must account for where Indigenous women reside, and recognize our rights. I will explain each of these further. Prioritize advice specific to Indigenous women's sovereignty and governance of our data and our right to lead and participate at all levels of decision-making related to our data. This means moving up the study's advice number 14 to inform the framing of all other recommendations and advice in the study. We need an Indigenous gender-based analysis and Indigenous women's leadership. This is integral to our data sovereignty and creating data collection practices that do not replicate colonial harms. Call for states to invest in Indigenous women to lead the development of national data collection practices and address data gaps. This means advising states to fund Indigenous women. Indigenous women must be able to lead data collection and dissemination practices. Without this, we risk states appropriating our experiences and voices, as was done by Canada through the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered and Indigenous Women and Girls by copyrighting our stories. We own and control our stories, including how they are shared, interpreted, and used. Chronic and ongoing underfunding to Indigenous women's organizations have restricted capacity building required for robust data governance frameworks. Acknowledge that Indigenous data governance structures must account for where Indigenous women reside and how we enact our inherent Indigenous rights. For example, 82% of Indigenous peoples in Canada live outside of their home communities, in rural and urban centers, and access services from Indigenous organizations that are outside Indigenous governed territories. We need data governance frameworks that emphasize Indigenous women's rights to ownership of our stories and data, no matter where they reside, including in urban centers. UNWA further encourages EMRIP to consider mechanisms and approaches for accountability. Canada just recently postponed work on the National Indigenous Peoples Survey due to limited funds. Indigenous women and our communities must not be seen as an area for efficiencies. We need to see action and accountability. Miigwech.
Thank you, Ms. Green, for your intervention. I'd like to now give the floor to Ms. Silje Karin Muotka from the Sami Parliament in Norway.
Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important agenda item. The Sami Parliament of Norway reaffirms that the ownership of intellectual property, including traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, and data, must rest firmly with Indigenous peoples themselves. This is not only a matter of justice, but of survival, dignity, and the right to self-determination. In recent years, we have increasingly recognized that data is power. Without access to disaggregated, culturally relevant data, we cannot fully understand the challenges our communities face, nor can we design effective policies to address them, whether it concerns Sami children in child welfare services, elderly Sami in the health system, or the prevalence of racism and discrimination. We are often left with anecdotal evidence and no statistical tools to back up our claims. This lack of data is not accidental, it's systemic, and it's deeply tied to the question of ownership. Who collects the data? Who controls it? Who decides how it is used? Chair, we believe that Sami data must be governed by Sami institutions according to Sami values. Inspired by the OCAP principles developed by First Nations in Canada, ownership, control, access, and possession, we have begun exploring frameworks for a Sami data governance. While we are still in the early stages, the conversations have begun. Seeds have been planted, and we are committed to nurturing them. But we must also acknowledge the risks. Many Samis are understandably skeptical of disaggregated data collection. Without robust safeguards, such data could be misused to stigmatize or marginalize our people. That is why any framework must be rooted in indigenous data sovereignty, with clear protocols to protect against misuse and ensure that data serves the interests of our communities. Chair, intellectual property is not limited to songs, stories, or symbols. It includes the right to define what knowledge matters, how it's collected, and who benefits from it. It includes the right to say no. And it includes the right to build our own systems of knowledge grounded in our language, our worldviews, and our ways of life. We call on states, UN bodies, and academic institutions to support indigenous-led efforts to develop data governance frameworks. We urge you to recognize that data sovereignty is not a technical issue, it's a human rights issue. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Ms. Yanel Jimenez from Land is Life.
Buenos días.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My name is Ms. Jimenez, a lawyer appointed by the Panamanian Indigenous Peoples groups. I express my serious concern to denounce the serious situation of repression, criminalization, and systematic violation of human rights that is faced by indigenous peoples in Panama, especially the Mandinka people. This has been happening for years, but in May, we organized ourselves to protest against the reform of the organic law related to social security, related to militarization, the reprisal or suppression of our peace protest. The government deployed the Omega operation, and this operation has led to 300 arbitrary detentions of women, young people, and leaders of indigenous peoples. And this is approximate data. Many of them have been left in incommunicado detention without any access to legal protection, submitted to torture and sexual violations. And data that is not fully confirmed. There's an excessive use of force by the state. Young people, children, older persons have been attacked with firearms, something that we confirmed. For example, a young child, Michelle Becker, lost her life use of tear gas. Up to date, approximately 8 persons are still considered as disappeared. Would like to urge the expert mechanism and the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Persons issue a joint public declaration that rejects the repression and the violence against our people, and also promote a platform for dialogue between the state and indigenous peoples to resolve the reasons for protests, ensure that those detained are freed, and punish those who are responsible. That the mechanism urges Panama to invite the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to carry out a country visit. Today, more than ever, our persons need this information and data to look towards the future and continue to ensure the protection of our historical memory. Thank you to the expert mechanism for this opportunity that brings together women to ensure that silence is not prevailing. Thank you.
For your intervention. I now give the floor to Ms. Ludmila Korotko from the Crimean Tatar Youth Centre.
Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished experts, colleagues, Indigenous sisters and brothers. We welcome EMRIP report and strongly support its core message that the rights to data, including collection, ownership, control, and disaggregation, is essential to realizing Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, development, and justice. Yet the report fails to reflect the reality of Indigenous peoples in armed conflict zones, such as the Crimean Tatar people, the Indigenous people of Ukraine. Since Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014 and full-scale invasion in 2022, Crimean Tatars have faced persecution, forced displacement, and the destruction of their institutions. But state data systems don't reflect this. Ukraine's state statistics service does not collect disaggregated data on ethnicity. The internally displaced persons register excludes ethnic origin. Even casualties, military service, and social needs are not recorded by indigenous affiliation. This absence of data creates invisibility, as the report rightly warns, and it blocks access to justice, protection, and resources. And it also affects political rights. According to the regulation on the election of the delegates of the Kurultai of the Crimean Tatar people, the highest representation institution, voter lists are compiled by Electoral Commission based on data from local majlises, who gather information on Crimean Tatars in cooperation with local governments. Without reliable demographic data, this process becomes fragile and vulnerable to disruption. The Crimean Tatar Resource Center, the leading indigenous NGO of Ukraine, has stepped in to fill this gap. Since 2015, the KTRC has documented human rights violations and war crimes in Crimea, and from 2022 in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. We maintain an electronic register of political prisoners, missing persons, and civilian victims, disaggregated by ethnic identity. This data is used to inform international mechanisms and advocacy, but it cannot replace institutional responsibility. We again note with concern that the EMRIP report did not reflect KTRC official submission. This submission unfortunately comes together with the fact that the current EMRIP member from our region is widely known to operate under the control of the Russian security services. This raises questions about the impartiality and accessibility of the mechanism for indigenous peoples under Russian pressure. In closing, I join the report's call to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to govern their own data, but stress that this must include those living in exile, under occupation, or in active war zones. Without visibility, there can be no any rights. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention, but please be mindful of your remark when it becomes personal, and just be mindful of the words that were mentioned by the chair in the opening session, to be respectful to all members. Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. Luis Chuquihuara from Peru.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Chair. We welcome the report of the expert mechanism on this very important issue for our countries. I'd like to say that Peru has a database on indigenous and original peoples that is an official source of information of the Peruvian state related to social, demographical, quantitative, and geographic information related to indigenous and regional peoples identified at the national level in line with the criteria established in the ILO Convention 169. This tool plays a very important role for the design and implementation of public policies related to indigenous or regional peoples that live in national territory at all levels of government. Thanks to the work of the Peruvian state, we were able to generate and consolidate robust and reliable information identifying officially 55 indigenous original peoples in our country. Out of them, 51 live in the Amazon region and 4 in the Andean region. Also in line with the question-related ethnical self-identification realized for the first time during National Census of 2017, more than 5 million Peruvians have expressed their desire to be considered as members of indigenous or original peoples, something that represents 25.8% of the national population of 12 years and older. We thank the expert mechanism having recognized in the report the efforts of Peru, as well as for the implementation of initiatives that are aimed at strengthening analysis and management of data on indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, I'd like to also inform that in April of this year, Peru developed a proposal for national policy on indigenous and regional peoples with the view of improving the quality of life of almost 6 million citizens that have been identified as being members of 55 indigenous and regional peoples of the country. The Ministry of Culture is promoting a process of prior consultation related to this policy with the view of ensuring its implementation on the basis of informed consent. Peru is seriously proud of its indigenous heritage, and we affirm our commitment to continue with the political will to strengthen the normative framework that is robust and harmonized with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, realizing on historical debt that still is outstanding. Peru will continue to promote public policies with an intercultural focus with the view of overcoming structural gaps and ensuring the effective participation of indigenous peoples with full respect of their diversity and fully inclusive. Thank you.
I would like to thank the ambassador from Peru, Mr. Luis Chukwuemeka, for his intervention. Thank you. I now give the floor to Scott Avery from the First Peoples Disability Network.
Good year. I am Dr. Scott Avery, a deaf and Aboriginal person from the Warramai people of Australia and Girimara Indigenous Health at the University of Technology, Sydney, Professor in Residence at the First Peoples Disability Network. I pay my respects to elders from the Indigenous nations and communities that are here today. When you look at the night sky, you can see the story of the universe on a grand scale. Individual stars, each with their own histories, group to form constellations. Constellations form galaxies, and galaxies combine to make up a universe. Some stars shine brightly, while others hide in dark matter, out of view, even though we know they are there. When it comes to the histories of Indigenous peoples, it is the data that tells our stories on a grand scale. Each statistic or number in a data report can be traced back to a person, an individual star who chose to share their stories with others, even if it meant they had to fill in a form as their way of doing so. It starts with one storyteller, then another, then another. And this goes on until there are enough people telling their story. It becomes a picture of communities grouping together to form a galaxy of Indigenous people's stories through time. Just as there is dark matter that exists in the universe which hides the stories of some stars and constellations, the same is true for data. The production of dark matter that sits over our data and stories is what colonialism has done to our histories. Colonialism sees the stories of some people as more important than the stories of others. The telescope focused first on the stars that spoke loudest and demanded the most attention, and those are the stories that were reflected in the data. Dark matter expanded and grew denser, stopping scholars and scientists from looking from other stars. But dark matter did not stop those stars from existing, even if they could not be seen with the naked eye. Indigenous knowledge keepers are leading a renaissance in reading the data in the universe with a wisdom that predates colonialism by time immemorial, adapting it with a vocabulary for contemporary times. There is the term disaggregation that describes how constellations within galaxies show a distinct pattern when the stars are joined. Then for constellations that cannot be seen, there is intersectionality. Intersectionality teaches us not only that dark matter exists, but why it exists and how do we see through it. Indigenous data sovereignty sets an ethical framework for the collection of data and telling of narrative that emerges from it. Respecting Indigenous data requires users to be faithful to the data who have granted the story. As our idea of country connects us to universe, we are connected to our communities through the data that tells the stories of our existence. Indigenous data sovereignty is not simply a right to access an array of numbers that is locked away by others. Data country reminds us that we are the data. Maringbu, thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Manira Tripura from the Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, for giving me the floor. And I would like to thank UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples for supporting me to attend this program. One of the main concerns of Indigenous peoples regarding the implementation of the SDGs is the lack of disaggregated data, which has resulted in their complete invisibility in Bangladesh, national reports and data collection process. Indigenous women suffer compound forms of discrimination in Bangladesh. To secure the rights of indigenous girls and women, states must engage in data collection efforts to fully assess the situation of indigenous women and girls and the forms of discrimination and gender-based violence that they face. State must undertake efforts to collect data disaggregated by range of factors including sex, age, indigenous origin, status, or identity. Indigenous women in Bangladesh are no exception. According to the PCGS's report from January to June 2025, there has been a noticeable increase in crimes committed against Jummo women. These crimes included rape, murder-following rape, attempt rape, sexual harassment, and fraud, mostly perpetrated by Bengali Muslim settlers, outsiders, laborers, and other professionals. During this period, 15 incidents of violence against Jummo women and girls are reported involving 16 victims of human rights violence in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, committed by Bengali Muslim settlers and security forces. Indigenous women should have the right to protect data related to their traditional knowledge and sacred sites. In this context, we recommended the flowing to EMRIP to our state when the government of Bangladesh must include an indigenous identifier in all official data collection process and ensure the availability of disaggregated data on indigenous peoples, particularly women and girls, in full partnership with indigenous institutions. This is essential for effective monitoring the situation of indigenous peoples and their access to basic service. Basic data collection concerning indigenous peoples must respect indigenous data sovereignty and adhere to ethical standards that safeguard traditional knowledge, culture, values, and human rights. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I now give the floor to Mr. Farid bin Ramdam from the Society Algerienne Savant de Donomastique. Mr. Farid, you have the floor.
Professeur Farid Ben Ramdan, président de la Société algérienne savante de nomades.
Association is dedicated to the scientific study of mystical entities. Data for indigenous peoples goes beyond technical matters and directly affects informational autonomy and self-determination. Data are tools for power. To gather them and interpret them relates to political decisions that cannot be unbiased nor universally implemented in the same way. Additionally, the text underscores the right to self-determination in Article 9 of the United Nations Declaration. The rights prohibits any administrative strict classification. However, we underscore three major risks. Political appropriation of data can lead to their exploitation and erasing indigenous people's realities. biased interpretations guided by management priorities distant from those of the communities. And third, the distinction between data and information is ambiguous. It doesn't consider the historical and symbolic dimensions. To redress this, strict citizen control is necessary, thanks to data platforms that can be done if there's ethical, rigorous oversight. And the document quite rightly focused on systemic intersectoral governance, which includes education, environment, culture, and the economy. Data gathering must be done in a participatory and comprehensive way. We would like to make 4 recommendations that are explicitly codified. 1, an international obligation to gather data based on the goal of reaching the common goal. 2nd, right to self-determination and setting up a protocol. And 3rd, to have multidimensional reference indicators that are localized and internationally recognized. And 3rd, to have multi-sectoral collective that allows indigenous peoples to control their own data. And lastly, it is important to point out that indicators are not the solution in of themselves. They are a tool to improve visibility, dignity, and self-determination. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Buram Doyle from Mauritius.
Thank you, Chair. I would respectfully request that I be put later on the list of speakers, please. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Ms. Maria Gonzalez Quiros from Chile.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Chair. It is an honor to participate in the 18th session of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We would like to extend cordial greetings to all participants, as well as to all those that are participating in this important event. In Chile, we are gathering more and more information on indigenous peoples by putting together questionnaires and by having information on topics such as housing, socioeconomic participation, political participation of indigenous women, and the state of languages. Also, there's an encouraging participation of indigenous organizations to validate data gathering instruments. It should be noted that on June 30th, 2025, the National Statistics Institute presented the results of the indigenous population that was part of the Population and Housing Census of 2024. And so now we have up-to-date demographic statistics. Additionally, we have data that was gathered through a social and economic broken down registry, the household registry, and data gathered by the National Corporation of Indigenous Development, which would then give him access to several social benefits for the indigenous population. For our country, it is important to also talk that we are constantly monitoring indigenous languages through the proper instruments that include indigenous participation. And this is done mindful of the implementation of the 10-year plan for indigenous languages. We have also invested efforts and time in updating data in order to quantify land requests of the Mapuche people as part of the Presidential Commission for Peace and Understanding. And so the report of the Commission has up-to-date statistics that will be useful in making recommendations, such as updating indigenous institutions in Chile and the economic and social development of affected regions. Madam Chair is making constant ongoing efforts in order to improve the right to participation in indigenous consultation and to gather data on indigenous people in keeping with ILO Agreement 169, which has been part of our legal order since 2009. Also, processes to gather data are being unrolled presently, calling on various indigenous peoples, various parts of our territory, covering topics such as the environment, mining, energy, housing, and public works. We would like to thank the Expert Mechanism for their commitment to promoting the rights of indigenous people.
you.